Gospel of Mark. We're still in section 1. We are in the second portion of section 1, which is kind of the climax of his ministry. He has done his work in and around Galilee. He is starting to move toward Jerusalem. And this is, there's just a whole series in Mark's Gospel here, starting in chapter 4, of things that he did and miracles that he worked and parables that he taught that are the climax of his work before his crucifixion. We talked last time about the appointing of the 12 apostles, actually not the appointing of the apostles, the naming of the 12 apostles. They weren't sent out as apostles yet, but they were identified. And your mother, your brothers, and your sister are looking for you. And he said, who are? These people that share in their faith with me, these are my family. There's kind of two things that's worth noting there. I'll accept his mother from this comment, but his siblings on the large part at this point in time did not believe in him. They thought he was crazy. They literally, and the text tells us, they thought he was crazy. He was born first.
He was. But it seems like they would have...
You have to have assumed they heard the story.
Yeah, so it's like, how could they be surprised?
Because there is a difference between being told something as a story and experiencing something.
And then he did kind of just do everyday life like they did.
Right. And for all of that time, from the time he was 12 until the time he started his ministry, the Bible's clear, he subjected himself to his parents. He lived just like you and me, with the exception of, according to Hebrews, he lived without sin. But he lived just like you and me. He subjected himself to his parents, to the governing authorities, to those people who had authority over him. He did the chores that he was assigned to do. He lived a completely normal life. And then all of a sudden he goes out and starts teaching people, essentially, I am God. He didn't use those exact words, but that's what he was telling them. And how would you approach your sibling who all of a sudden started telling people, hey, you need to listen to me because I created all this? You would say he's lost his mind. Human aspect. When you looked at Jesus, what did you see? You saw a man. Their problem was in seeing God in the person Jesus. They saw Jesus and not fully grasp what his humanity entailed. We have in fact, there was a big brouhaha among preachers about 25 years ago on that very question. What was the nature of Jesus in terms of his humanity? And trying to grapple with and understand that he was fully man in every respect as we are is really hard for people to do who aren't looking at him. But when you are looking at him and he's getting hungry and he's sweating and he bleeds, you have no problem seeing his humanity. You have a problem seeing him as anything different than humanity. So to grasp the nature of that unique being who was eternal God with us in the flesh is a Herculean thing. To actually grasp what it being eternal God, the nature of humanity. And in that respect, the Bible says that he grew. Not just in physical stature, but also what? In spirit. How does God grow? An omniscient God, how does he learn? And yet the text says he learned to be obedient in all things. And so for them, it was the other problem, the exact opposite problem, because it's just like looking at two sides of a coin. The one you're looking at, you can describe. The one you can't see, that's the one you can't really describe in detail. We can see the divinity part of him a whole lot more clearly because we're not looking at his body. And because of that, we fail to grasp part of what's going on here, and the other part of what's going on here is spiritual things are more important than our physical things. Than our physical treasures. He taught that, right? Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, not treasures on earth, where thieves break in and steal. Okay? Understand that the spiritual wealth that we can possess is more valuable than the physical wealth that we can possess. Here, specifically, he's saying that our spiritual relationship. Does that mean that our physical relationships aren't important? Nope, doesn't mean that at all. Does that mean that we should abandon our responsibilities? Absolutely doesn't mean that. That's addressed in some of the epistles where actually people kind of started thinking that way. And that had to be addressed. No, you still have obligations to your mother and father. You still have obligations to your wife. You still have obligations to these people that you need to keep. But there is a superiority of the spiritual relationships that we sustain. So God has to be more important than your parent. Make those relationships less important than they are. It just simply says that our spiritual relationship with God is even greater. As great as those relationships are, that relationship is even more. And that's essentially what he's saying. This is my family. These people who are following God. And it's very similar to what happens with Mary and Martha, right? The people and Jesus is teaching. One of them carries out her very real everyday life responsibility of showing hospitality to the people in her house. And the other one does what? Sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him. And ultimately Jesus says what? That the one that engaged in the spiritual had chose the better part. The more important part. And so we have to start kind of thinking along those lines and understanding what his brothers primarily, and I guess his sisters as well, had trouble doing was seeing him as anything more than a sibling. And worse than that, an older sibling. Or at least in my house, my job. Bigger than me, stronger than me, and faster than me. I had to prove that I wasn't second to him in anything. At least in my mind, I had to prove that. Occasionally, he got the better of me than him, and faster than him, and more athletic than him. But anyway, that's just the way we are to a large degree. It was no different for them. They had trouble seeing past his body. Why? Even though they more than likely, we're not told whether they heard the story, but more than likely they had. I will. They had trouble seeing past his body. Why? Even though they more than likely, we're not told whether they heard the story, but more than likely they had. I will. these things in her heart. Mary remembered these things. Whether or not she talked about them often, I don't know. But you have to assume that they knew. And with that assumption in place, it's simply a matter of there's a difference between seeing and hearing. In other words, I guess the best way I can explain that is someone can tell you how beautiful the Grand Canyon is, but when do you actually grasp the vastness of the Grand Canyon? When you stand at the rim and look at it. That's the first time you really grasp how big it is and how beautiful it is. Despite the fact that you may have seen pictures and you may have heard descriptions. How powerful is the ocean? I want to tell you, when you find out is when you're in the ocean and you can't fight against the tide and it is pulling you away from land and it is taking you under. That's when you find out how powerful the ocean is, when you experience. All the time that say, be careful of the riptides in certain areas. And they even put flags out. And so flags are flying and the people drown, don't get out there, be careful of the riptides. And then people go out in the ocean and do what? They drown in the riptides. I promise you, when they're under the water and they're thinking about their circumstances, they, for probably the first time in their life, understand the significance of the flags that they've always seen flying. And for the first time in life, they finally understand the importance of those flags flying. When they crawled into water that day, you know what they thought about those flags? Now all of a sudden they think, wait a minute, that hasn't been. That is exactly the same thing that we were told about the rich man in Luke 16 in the story of the Lazarus and the rich man. When did the rich torment? Before then it was, what was important to him? His wealth and his clothes and his house and his food. Seeing, experiencing spiritual existence. That's what made him understand how valuable the soul is. That's a problem and a struggle that we all have. Same thing with this book. Way too many people think that it's what? Just a book. It's the power of God unto salvation. The power of God. The power that speaks the world into existence, that made the stars, that put them in their place and hold them in their course, that keeps life sustained every day on this earth. That power, right? One day when we come face to face with the things that it's talking about, and we grasp firsthand. Until then, we're more like Peter. When he's put in those circumstances, denies the Lord. You know, he believed that, but he didn't fully grasp that it would actually happen. By the way, by the end of his life, what was he willing to do? Die. So he learned, he grew, he developed that understanding. He came to know what Jesus meant when he said, don't fear those who kill the body, but can do nothing to the soul. Instead, fear those who can destroy both. He came to know what that meant. And that's what we're striving to do. And so that's part of the teaching here. On what they are experiencing. They experienced Jesus as a brother in the flesh. They didn't experience him as God. When did some of his brothers come around? After the resurrection. James, for instance, was the brother of the Lord. He ends up being used as a prophet of God to write the book of James. He ends up being an influential and powerful leader in the first century church because of his faith. Apparently he didn't have that before. It was after coming face to face with a risen Jesus that he came to grasp that that his brother was God. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? After living with someone, growing up with them, having all these experiences with them, seeing them, and then come to realize, wait a minute, the whole time that was God. How many times do we try to fool our siblings and cover things up and hide things from them? The whole time, that was God. He saw right through it. Got to be an amazing revelation. I don't envy them. I don't envy them that. So, anyway, any other questions or comments about that? I appreciate the question. I like those kinds of things. I'm trusting that my son in there is following the chat and feeds on social media. So if you're getting questions or comments in there, he'll stick his head out and let us know. So if you're watching online, ask your questions or make your comments. We'll get them into the discussion. All right, let's go to chapter 4, the parable of the sower. In the time that we have, again, he began to teach beside the sea. A very large crowd gathered about him so that he got into a boat, and he sat on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. Now, this is just a practical scenario. How many people were there? Well, we don't have an exact number, but it was a large enough crowd, and they were pressing against him enough that the practical way to address them was to separate themselves somewhat from the assembly by getting on a boat and going out in the water and then addressing them while they crowded along the shoreline. It's very much akin to what we do in a setting like this. If this building's completely full and has the 225 or 28 or 38, or I forget how many people it holds, but it's pushing 250 there in these seats. If this building was completely full like that, the reason why there's 10 feet and then a raised speaker stand is so that everybody can see and hear, to make it practical for pulling himself away so that he can address the entire crowd, so that everybody can see and hear him. He was teaching them many things in parables. We do not have everything that he taught them on this day. We don't have every parable that he told on this day. But we do have one or two that are important for the purposes of the revelation of God through Mark. He said, "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell among the path, and the birds came and devoured it. And others fell among the rocky ground where it did not have as much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. And other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good 100-fold. And he said, he who has ears to hear, let him listen. And when he was alone," so the scenario's changed, right? The setting has changed. He's no longer with this large crowd of people on a boat preaching to them. He's now alone. 12, ask him. So that this is the group that eventually would become the 120 that were with him at the end, that was in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. That's the larger group. The 12 are among that group. You'll be reminded that earlier in Mark, in the previous chapter, when among his disciples, this is that larger group of disciples of which the 12 were a part of. Those around him with the 12 ask him about the parables. But to those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. Now this seems kind of odd. What's his purpose in talking to people and teaching? Why did he come to the earth? To save. And how was he going to save? By disclosing the will of God. And yet he says, look, it's for you to of God, but I speak to parables so that they indeed may see but not perceive. He wants people to perceive. So what's he talking about here when he says, I speak in parables so that, and this is a key to may not perceive. So that those who are outside God doesn't remove our free will choices. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the power of God unto salvation. But that's not all that passage teaches us about this word, is it? If this were the power of God unto salvation, and that was a universal statement and that contained every truth pertaining to his word, who could resist it? Who can resist the power of God? But it's not presented in such a way where it can't be resisted. Why do you speak in parables? So that people who don't want to perceive, so that people who don't want to understand, so that people who want to exercise their will to reject me, so they can. So that they have a way in which to reason within themselves and reject who I am, what I came to do, and what they need to do. That he has retained in us our what? Our free will, our ability to choose for ourselves whom we will serve. I teach this way so that people who wish to reject me can not see, cannot perceive, cannot understand. Lest they should turn and be forgiven. He said to them, do you not understand the parable? How then will you understand all the parables? If you don't understand this, how are you going to understand any of them? We have to understand the purpose of parables. We have to understand the nature of parables in order to grasp them. We have to be looking for the truth in parables in order to see it. The sower sows the word. So when you read that parable, the sower went out to sow the seed. What's he talking about? Of salvation with people. Sharing the gospel. Spreading the gospel into the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word, and it's not sown. So we got the beaten path. People, the ground doesn't receive the seed. It stays lying on top of the ground. The bird can come and just easily take it and go off. Can take it away. These are the ones sown on the rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. You ever see anybody like that? Real quick, excited. They have no root in themselves. They don't mature. They don't grow up. But endure for a little while, and then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. You ever seen anybody like that? Come in like gangbusters, hang around for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then you never see them again? Others are the ones sown among the thorns. They're those who hear the word. The cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. That's the one I don't like. I wish you wouldn't have taught that one. Because that's the one that most clearly reflects me, if I'm honest. I let life get in the way of service to God. I let my concerns in time get in the way of my service to God. I let other things. I love the way Mark puts it here. The cares of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, the desires for other things enter in and choke the word. And then he said, but those, in verse 20, that were sown on good soil are the ones who hear the word, accept it, and bear fruit. Then the other part of this story is not every plant yields exactly the same amount of fruit. Doesn't have to. Some 30, some 60, and some 100-fold. Is the 30-fold bearer any less a good recipient of the gospel than the 100-fold bearer? Absolutely not. We're not judged on the volume. We're judged on what? On being good, on receiving, on growing, on producing what we can. In another parable, he would talk about individuals who had various skill sets that warranted entrusting them with various amounts of money. Those that he entrusted with 1 talent, those that he entrusted with 2 talents, those that he entrusted with 5 talents. The ones that used those skills and the same blessing. The 2 and the 5 talent man were both equally blessed, even though the 2 talent man only produced 2 talents and the 5 talent man produced 5 more talents. It wasn't based on that absolute number. It was based on what? The way in which they engaged, the genuineness of their faith and obedience. Watching people putting into the treasury. And he sees the people who put in a lot of money, and then he sees this widow woman come in and drop in just a mite. She gave more than all the rest. And our response would be, wait a minute, this guy dropped a $10,000 check in there and she dropped a penny in there. How in the world can you say that she gave more than? That's what he's looking at, is our devotion to him, our faithfulness to him. The measure of how we receive the word. And you're born unable to speak. Does that make you less of a Christian if you truly believe and serve God? No, but how would most people look at the renowned gospel preacher opposed to the guy who never said a word? Who would we think is more important? That's part of what he's teaching here. You want to understand the kingdom of God, you understand it's not about how many things you do, it's about how genuine your faith is. It's about whether you're receiving the word and doing all that you are able. Because that's what the word teaches us, right? The word tells me that if I sit back able to do something and I don't do it, well, for me, that's sin. Whereas if someone else doesn't do it because they're not able, that doesn't constitute sin. It's not a matter of whether it's done or not done. It's a matter of whether it's done in faith. Now, does that give me license to not do? Absolutely not. It actually challenges me to do what? To strive to do everything that I can do. I want to be the plant that yields 100-fold. But at the end of the day, if I only yield 30, guess what? Enter into the glories of your master. And so he's teaching so that somebody sitting out here can listen to this and say, it's not my fault I didn't believe. Satan came and took the seed away from me. Receive it in the first place. Did you notice that in the story? Take it away, but the good soil over here received the seeds. Grew into a plant. Why wasn't the bird able to take that seed? Because that soil received the seed. The first soil didn't receive it. If I reject what I read, I can't blame that on Satan. That's on me. I'm empowering Satan to do his work. Now, is he going to let it go? No, he's going to take full advantage of it, right? Use it to his advantage. But it's all about me. However, if that's not the way I wish to read this parable, if I wish to read this parable as talking about the sower and whether he's doing his job right, or talk about the bird and what the bird did, or talk about the rocks and what the rocks did, or talk about the weeds and what the weeds did, you know, that sower should have took those thorns and thistles out, and then it wouldn't have choked me. It's the sower's fault. No. It's me desiring those things over my need to bear fruit. The way James would talk about that situation, by the way, is if you see your brother and sister in need and you have, and you don't give, where's your faith? That's someone, and to use this language here, the desires or the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things, that is what takes over. I have the desire to hang on to what I have rather than share it with the one who doesn't have. That keeps me from bearing fruit. If I have it and I see the need and I'm not willing to let go of it, that's keeping me from bearing fruit in the kingdom. If I have it and I see the need and I give it willingly, faithfully, because I understand that God has taught me to care and have compassion and to help people in their needs, that's bearing fruit. That makes me part of the good soil as opposed to part of the thorny soil. That falls directly on me. That's not the thorn's fault. We have another parable. Is a lamp brought in to be put under a basket or under a bed and not on a stand? You buy a new lamp. You bring it home, you plug it in, you turn it on, and you put it under your bed? Is that what you do? What do? Supposed to supply light to the room. You don't hide it. Nothing is hidden except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. If anyone has ears, let him hear. He said to them, pay attention to what you hear. With the measure you use it, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added. With the measure you use it. That's where it comes in. I'm here and I'm listening, and what am I going to do with this? Am I going to hide it, or am I going to use it? With the measure that you use it, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added. I'm not growing like I ought to. I'm not growing like I want to. You know why? You know why I may not be? Because I may not be using what I've already been given. And still more will be added to you. For the one who has, more will be given. From the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. That is directly the teaching at the end of the parable of the talents, right? The 1 talent man has what he had taken away from him, and it was given to the 5 talent man. Why? Because the 5 talent man was using. That is nothing more than living the faith. We're out of time. Lord willing, we will pick up in verse 26 with the after that. So chapter